But this was only the beginning, because what started as a quiet imbalance of power was about to become something impossible to hide. And when the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't just expose a secret, it would expose an entire system built on silence. There are houses you pass every day, and then there are houses you feel, even when you're not looking at them. This one stood just outside a quiet Alabama town, wrapped in old trees, its paint faded by time, its windows dark, as if they were watching instead of waiting. People didn't point at it. They didn't warn their children out loud. They simply crossed the street or drove a little faster. No one could explain why. Because the house never screamed, it never collapsed, it never made headlines, it just stayed. And sometimes, the most terrifying stories are the ones that never announced themselves, long before it became a place of silence. This house was a symbol of respect, order, control. In the early 1800s, it belonged to one of the town's most well-known families, a family people trusted, a family people admired, and at the center of it all were two sisters. They were twins, identical in appearance, almost identical in manner, same posture, same measured smiles, same calm eyes that never revealed too much. From the outside, they looked like a perfect reflection, but reflections can lie. The sisters were raised to understand power. Not loud power, not violent power, quiet power. The kind that doesn't need to be explained. The kind that simply exists, because no one questions it. They learned early that silence could be more effective than anger. That control didn't come from force alone, but from expectation. And this house was built on expectations. Every floorboard had been walked on with certainty. Every hallway echoed with decisions already made. Nothing here happened by accident, especially not the lives inside it. Among the many people who lived and worked on the property, there was one man who stood out, not because he was noticed, but because he was never meant to be. History would not remember his name easily. Records would reduce him to numbers, to labor, to ownership. But he was a man. He woke before sunrise. He worked until his body ached. He listened more than he spoke. And over time, he learned something dangerous. He learned how invisible he truly was. In that invisibility, a different kind of tension grew. The sisters noticed him, not suddenly, not dramatically. It happened slowly. A glance held a second longer, a task requested instead of assigned, a silence that lingered in a room after others had left. Nothing improper on the surface, nothing anyone could accuse, yet something shifted. The house felt it first. Doors closed more often, conversations lowered, movements became deliberate. The sisters were rarely apart, but now they began to meet him separately, not by plan, not by declaration, by circumstance, or at least that's how it appeared. He never questioned the pattern. Questioning was never an option. What he felt didn't matter. What he wanted didn't exist. And yet, he was at the center of something that would eventually consume all of them. The arrangement that formed was never spoken aloud. There were no rules written, no agreement acknowledged, only understanding, an understanding shaped by power, fear, and the knowledge that silence protected everyone, except the one who had none. Days passed, then weeks, and with time, the house began to change again. Not in its walls, not in its structure, in its rhythm. The sisters became restless, their calm confidence replaced by something sharper, more fragile. They watched each other now, measured glances, unspoken tension. The man noticed it, even if he didn't understand it. He felt the weight of being the thing that could never be discussed. And outside the house, the town began to sense it too. People noticed fewer public appearances, fewer smiles at church, more distance. Rumors didn't start yet, but silence thickened. Because secrets don't stay contained forever. They press outward, and this one was pressing hard, late at night, when the house should have been asleep. Lamps stayed lit. Footsteps echoed where they hadn't before. The house was listening. The house was remembering, and history was already taking notes, even if no one else was. They were known long before they were questioned. In the town's memory, the sisters were not rumors or shadows. They were presence. People remembered them walking side by side down the main street. Their steps matched. Their dresses simple but perfectly kept. They never rushed, never looked lost, never appeared unsure. To outsiders, they seemed calm, respectful, almost gentle, the kind of women you trusted without knowing why. In church, they sat in the same pew every Sunday, always together, hands folded, eyes lowered at the right moments, standing when expected, singing softly, never louder than those around them. They were admired for their discipline, for their manners, for their restraint, in a time when emotion was often seen as weakness. The sisters were praised for having none. Neighbors spoke of them with approval. They were raised right, people would say. Strong values, a good family. No one questioned what those values truly were. They had grown up inside the same house that now stood silent, raised by rules that were never written, but always enforced. From a young age, they were taught that the world had an order, that some people gave instructions and others followed them, that this was not cruelty, but structure, and structure, they were told, was necessary. The sisters learned to speak calmly, even when angry. They learned to smile politely, even when bored. They learned that appearing composed was more important than being understood. Most importantly, they learned that consequences applied differently, depending on who you were. That lesson stayed with them. As they grew older, their bond deepened. They shared everything, rooms, meals, thoughts that were never spoken to anyone else. When one felt unsettled, the other sensed it. When one hesitated, the other filled the silence. People admired their closeness, calling it rare, calling it beautiful. But closeness can blur boundaries. And when boundaries blur, lines disappear. The sisters did not compete with each other in obvious ways. There were no loud arguments, no public disagreements. Their rivalry, if it could be called that, lived beneath the surface, quiet, measured, patient. They were used to having what they wanted, not because they demanded it, but because the world had been arranged to give it to them. That expectation followed them into adulthood. When responsibility for the house fell fully to them, nothing seemed to change. They managed it together. Decisions were mutual. Orders were given calmly. People obeyed, including him. At first, he was simply another presence in the background, reliable, silent, efficient. He did not look people in the eye unless spoken to. He did not linger. He did not draw attention. That made him valuable. Over time, the sisters began to notice details others ignored. The way he moved through rooms without sound. The way he waited for instructions. Even when he already knew what needed to be done, he did not question. He did not hesitate. In their world, that was obedience. But obedience can also be interpreted as availability. When power goes unchecked. One of the sisters noticed him first. Though she never admitted it, it was subtle, a request for help instead of a command. A pause after he completed a task, a moment of eye contact held just a second too long. The other sister noticed the change soon after. She did not confront it. She did not ask questions. She observed. She watched how often his name was spoken, how often his presence was required, how the house's routine shifted around him. She felt something unfamiliar. Not jealousy, not fear, ownership. Neither sister considered his perspective. That was never part of the equation. He was not seen as someone with choices, but as someone whose presence could be arranged. And so, without a conversation, without an agreement, without acknowledgement, a pattern formed. They both expected him to comply, because compliance was all he had ever been allowed. Days blurred into weeks. The house grew quieter. The sisters stopped leaving the property as often. They spent more time indoors, moving through familiar rooms with new intentions. Meals were eaten in silence now, not comfortable silence, calculated silence. The man sensed the tension. He felt it in the pauses between instructions, in the way his movements were watched. He did not understand the rules, but he knew breaking them would be dangerous. So he stayed silent, stayed present, stayed exactly where he was expected to be. Outside, the town continued its routine. People waved. People smiled. No one suspected anything. Why would they? The sisters were respected. The house was respected. The system itself was respected. And systems rarely question themselves. But tension has a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully it's buried. Small changes appeared first: fatigue, irritability, moments where the sisters' perfect synchronization faltered. They noticed it in each other: a look held too long, a breath taken sharply, a room entered at the wrong moment. Still, nothing was said, because speaking would mean admitting something existed. And once something exists, it can be judged. They believed silence was safer. They were wrong. The house began to feel heavy, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the strain. Late nights became common, restless pacing, windows left open longer than necessary. And beneath it all, the unspoken truth pressed harder. Something was changing, something irreversible. Neither sister understood the full weight of what was unfolding. They believed control would protect them, that their status would shield them. They had never considered what happens when secrets grow beyond their ability to contain them. And the man, he understood something they did not. That silence does not mean safety. It only delays the moment of impact, because history does not forget imbalance forever. It waits, and soon, the house would face the cost of what had been allowed to happen inside its walls. The calm image the town admired was beginning to crack, and when it did, no one involved would escape unchanged. What no one knew yet was that the truth was already moving toward the surface, quietly, relentlessly, and once it arrived, there would be no way to pretend this was ever just another well-kept secret. He was never meant to be remembered. In the records of that time, men like him were reduced to entries, to inventory, to proof of ownership. No childhood stories were preserved. No birthdays recorded. No family names protected. If history mentioned him at all, it would be without a voice. But inside the house, he existed very clearly. Every morning began the same way. Before the sun fully rose, he was already awake, not because he wanted to be, but because the day demanded it. He moved quietly through the house, careful not to disturb what he did not own. Floorboards that creaked under others somehow stayed silent beneath his feet. He learned where to step, where not to pause, where to disappear. That skill, the ability to exist without being seen, kept him alive. From the outside, his life looked simple: work, obedience, silence. But inside his mind, there was constant calculation. Every instruction carried weight. Every glance meant something. Every pause could be dangerous. He learned early that asking questions only brought attention, and attention was never safe. So he listened, he remembered, he endured. When the sisters addressed him, their voices were calm, never raised, never rushed. That calm made their words heavier. They did not need to threaten him. They did not need to explain consequences. The system had already done that for them. At first, their requests stayed within the routine: work around the house, errands, repairs, nothing unusual. But over time, the tone changed, not in volume, in intention. They asked him to stay longer, to return after dark, to wait instead of leaving. He obeyed, because obedience was survival. He noticed the way each sister looked at him differently. One studied him openly, as if evaluating something she already owned. The other watched him quietly, her gaze sharper, more deliberate. He could feel the difference, but he did not understand what it meant. Understanding was not required of him, only compliance. There were moments when the house felt too small, when the air grew thick, when silence stretched longer than comfort allowed. In those moments, he wished he could vanish completely. But invisibility only works until someone decides to see you. And both sisters had seen him, not as a man, not as a person, but as something that existed for their use. The pattern intensified slowly, so slowly that no one could point to the moment it crossed a line. There was no dramatic beginning, no single event, just repetition. Requests became expectations. Expectations became routine, and routine became something else entirely. He stopped being surprised. Surprise implies hope. He learned instead to brace himself, to separate his body from his thoughts, to let time pass without leaving marks on his face. At night, when the house finally slept, he sat alone with his thoughts. He thought about freedom, not as a destination, but as an idea, something distant, unreachable. He knew escape was not realistic. The world outside the house was no safer than the one inside. Everywhere he went, the same rules applied, the same eyes watched, the same power decided. So he stayed, not because he accepted his place, but because resistance would cost him more than submission ever could. The sisters believed they understood him. They believed silence meant agreement. They never considered that silence was the only language he was allowed to speak. Over time, their confidence grew. They no longer hesitated, no longer questioned. What had once felt risky now felt inevitable. They controlled the narrative, the house, the rules, and they believed that control made them untouchable. He noticed changes in their behavior, more tension between them, less harmony. Their shared certainty began to fracture. Sometimes they avoided each other, sometimes they watched each other closely. He was the constant between them, the unspoken connection, the thing neither would name that made his position more dangerous than ever. He became aware of how easily blame could shift, how quickly power could turn. If something went wrong, he would be the first to suffer. That knowledge stayed with him, heavy and unavoidable. He measured every movement now, every word, every silence, because he knew something was building. Not anger, not violence, consequences. The house felt different too, as if it recognized the imbalance growing inside it. Rooms felt tighter, corridors longer, shadows deeper. Even during the day, the light seemed cautious. The sisters continued to present themselves as composed, controlled, untouched by doubt. But control is fragile when it relies on silence, and silence, once stretched too far, breaks. He sensed the shift before they did. His body knew it. Fatigue settled deeper, a constant tension in his chest. Something irreversible was approaching. He could not stop it, could not influence it. All he could do was exist inside it and wait, because history often moves forward on the backs of those who are never asked to speak, and when it does, it rarely asks permission. The man had no voice, but his presence was about to change everything, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. What none of them fully understood yet was that the truth they were trying to control was already beyond their reach, and once it revealed itself, no amount of power, nothing about it was ever announced. There was no moment where someone said, "This is what we're doing now." No agreement, no rule, no boundary crossed in a single step. It formed the way dangerous things often do, quietly, through assumption. By the time any of them could have questioned it, the shape of it was already fixed. The sisters never discussed it directly. They did not need to. They had spent their entire lives communicating without words. A look, a pause, a change in routine. That was enough. Each of them believed they understood the situation. Each of them believed they were in control of it, and neither of them stopped to consider that control built on silence is never shared evenly.
The man remained exactly where he had always been, in the space between decisions.
In the gap where responsibility disappeared. No one asked him what he wanted. No one checked what it cost him. Because acknowledging his perspective, which forced them to confront their own actions, and that was something they were not prepared to do. At first, the arrangement felt contained, private, manageable. The house had always held secrets. This was just another one. They believed walls could protect them, that reputation could shield them, that their position placed them beyond consequence. The sisters moved carefully, but not cautiously. They trusted the system that had always protected them, a system that excused their behavior before it ever examined it. They controlled schedules, they controlled access, they controlled who saw what and when, and for a while it worked. The man followed the rhythm set for him. He appeared when expected. He left when dismissed. He did not resist. He did not protest, not because he agreed, but because resistance was not a language. The system allowed him to speak. Inside, he separated himself from what was happening. He focused on survival, on keeping his expression neutral, on not revealing fear or anger or exhaustion. Emotion made people unpredictable. Unpredictability attracted attention. Attention was dangerous. The sisters interpreted his stillness as acceptance. They told themselves what they needed to believe, that they were not doing harm, that nothing was being taken, that this was simply how things worked. Over time, the balance between them began to shift. What had once felt shared now felt contested. They watched each other more closely, measured reactions, counted moments. They noticed who spoke first, who gave instructions, who lingered longer. Small differences became significant. Neither sister wanted to acknowledge the tension. Admitting it would mean admitting. Vulnerability. And vulnerability in their world was unacceptable. So they ignored it. They doubled down on control. The man felt the change immediately. The air between them grew tighter, expectations sharper, mistakes less tolerated. He realized he was no longer just invisible. He was central, and being central without power is one of the most dangerous positions a person can occupy. He became careful in new ways, avoiding eye contact, minimizing presence, trying to disappear even more than before. But the arrangement did not allow disappearance. He was required. That requirement weighed on him. At night, he lay awake listening to the house settle, wood cooling, distant sounds fading. He thought about the future, not as hope, but as risk. Every passing day increased the chances that someone would notice something was wrong. A look held too long, a routine disrupted, a physical change that could not be hidden. The sisters believed they could manage any complication. They had always done so. They underestimated one thing: time. Time exposes patterns. Time erodes secrecy. And the body, no matter how controlled the mind believes itself to be, reveals the truth eventually. The first signs were easy to dismiss: fatigue, mood changes, subtle discomfort. They told themselves it was nothing: stress, routine disruption. But the signs did not fade. They grew. The sisters reacted differently. One became more rigid, more insistent on order. Schedules tightened. Privacy increased. The other grew restless, irritable, easily distracted. Their unity fractured further. Still, no one spoke the obvious. Speaking would force decisions. Decisions carried risk. Silence felt safer. The man understood the danger more clearly than either of them, because danger had always found him first. He noticed the fear they refused to name. He saw it in their movements, in their sudden pauses, in the way their voices tightened. He knew that when consequences arrived, they would not fall evenly. They never had. If blame was required, it would not land on those with power. That knowledge sat heavy in his chest. He considered running, briefly, but he knew what waited beyond the house. The same system, the same rules. There was nowhere safe to go, so he stayed, and the house continued to absorb the weight of what was happening inside it. It held the tension in its walls, in its narrow corridors, in rooms that now felt charged rather than quiet. Something irreversible had begun, not because of a single act, but because no one stopped it. The arrangement that was never named had grown beyond anyone's ability to control, and the closer the truth moved to the surface, the more fragile the sisters' confidence became. They had believed secrecy was protection. They were about to learn that secrecy is only temporary, and when it breaks, it does not do so gently. The house was no longer just witnessing events. It was waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough, and that moment was closer than any of them realized. It started with small things, so small that anyone looking from the outside would have missed them completely. A chair pulled back a little slower than usual, a hand resting on the table longer than necessary, a pause before standing, as if the body needed extra time to obey the mind. The sisters noticed these things immediately. They had been trained to notice details, changes in behavior, shifts in routine. Control depends on awareness, and awareness had always been their strength. At first, they dismissed what they saw. Fatigue, they told themselves. Stress, too many responsibilities. They had managed the house for years. They were capable. They were composed. This was nothing, but nothing does not linger. Nothing does not repeat itself. The signs returned, again and again. One sister watched closely but said nothing. The other avoided looking too long, as if eye contact might confirm something she wasn't ready to face. The house continued its routine, but the rhythm was off. Meals were delayed. Tasks took longer. Silences stretched. The man felt it too. He sensed the shift before it became obvious. He felt it in his body, in the way the air seemed heavier, in the way instructions carried a sharper edge. He became more careful than ever. Every movement was measured, every response controlled. He understood something they were still refusing to acknowledge. When a system built on silence begins to crack, it looks for somewhere to place the pressure, and pressure always travels downward. He noticed how the sisters began watching each other, not openly, not with accusation, with calculation. They compared reactions, measured expressions, noted who entered rooms first and who left last. Their unity, once effortless, now required effort, and effort reveals strain. Outside the house, the town continued as usual. People greeted the sisters politely, asked about the property, spoke of weather and routine. No one asked personal questions. Reputation still protected them, but reputation is only effective as long as it remains unquestioned. The first real disturbance came quietly. A neighbor mentioned concern, not directly, not accusing, just a comment about appearances, about how tired one of the sisters looked, about how rarely they were seen in public lately. The words were casual, but they landed heavily. Concern is dangerous. Concern invites attention. That night, the house felt restless. Lights stayed on longer. Footsteps echoed after midnight. Doors opened and closed softly, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The sisters spoke in low voices, careful not to be overheard. Their confidence was still there, but it was thinner now. They discussed schedules, routines, who would be present and when. They told themselves this was precaution, that control was simply being reinforced. But beneath the planning, fear had entered the room. The man listened from where he stood, out of sight. He understood the danger clearly now. He was no longer just part of a secret. He was the most visible risk. Any consequence that followed would move toward him first. That knowledge tightened his chest. He avoided common spaces, completed tasks quickly, left rooms before he was asked. Still, it was not enough. The signs were becoming harder to hide. Physical changes cannot be reasoned away forever. They demand acknowledgement. The sisters reacted differently. One became colder, more distant, her voice firm, her instructions brief. She believed discipline could restore balance. The other grew agitated. Her patience shortened. Her control slipped in moments she could not afford. She paced, she hesitated, she questioned decisions she once made without thought. That difference created friction, unspoken blame began to form. Neither sister admitted it, but both felt it. If this situation turned against them, responsibility would need to be assigned, and neither was willing to carry it alone. The man felt the shift in their behavior toward him. Instructions became sharper. Tolerance disappeared. Where once silence had been enough, now perfection was expected. Mistakes were no longer ignored. They were remembered. He knew what that meant. The margin for error was gone. At night he lay awake, listening to the house settle. He thought about the future, not with hope, but with calculation. He knew that if questions were asked, he would not be allowed to answer them. If explanations were required, he would not be permitted to speak. The truth, whatever it became, would be shaped without him. That realization was heavy. The sisters still believed they could manage. What was happening? They had managed everything else in their lives. They underestimated one thing: visibility. When secrets begin to show, they draw attention whether invited or not. The house could feel it. Visitors were discouraged now. Curtains stayed drawn. Public appearances became rare. Isolation tightened around the property like a fence. But isolation amplifies pressure. It does not relieve it. The town began to notice the absence. Questions, once unthinkable, started to form quietly, not accusations, curiosity. Curiosity is where exposure begins. The sisters sensed it too. Their confidence was no longer absolute. Their control no longer unquestioned. They were running out of time. The man understood the reality before anyone else did. Something irreversible was approaching, not because of malice, not because of intention, but because silence had limits, and those limits were about to be tested. Very soon, what had been hidden inside the house would no longer stay contained, and when that happened, someone would pay the price. The only question left was who the system would choose, and history, as always, had its preferences. The truth did not arrive loudly. There was no sudden confrontation, no dramatic announcement, no single moment where everything stopped. Instead, it surfaced the way truth usually does in places built on silence. Slowly, inevitably, and without asking permission. It began with a realization that could no longer be ignored. The sisters noticed it almost at the same time, though neither acknowledged it out loud. They felt it in their bodies first, in the way energy faded too quickly, in the discomfort that refused to pass, in the subtle signs that did not belong to coincidence. At first, they told themselves stories, simple ones, comforting ones, stress, routine changes, the weight of responsibility. They had always been in control. This would be no different. But the body does not negotiate with denial. As days passed, the signs became clearer, more insistent, impossible to dismiss. And with clarity came fear. Not fear of discovery, but fear of what discovery would mean. They had spent their lives protected by structure, by reputation, by a system that rewarded their position. Now that same structure felt fragile. The house seemed to notice it too. Rooms felt smaller, air heavier. Even familiar spaces carried an unfamiliar tension. They avoided each other at first, not intentionally, instinctively. Eye contact lingered too long. Silences became uncalm, forcible. They both understood what was happening, but neither wanted to be the first to name it. Naming something gives it power, and power, once shared, can no longer be controlled alone. The man sensed the shift immediately. He did not need confirmation. He recognized fear when he saw it. He saw it in the way instructions were delivered, more carefully now, as if every word carried weight. He saw it in the way the sisters' movements changed, protective, measured, alert. He knew then that the secret had crossed a line. Whatever came next would not be contained within the house. The sisters finally spoke, not openly, not honestly. They spoke in fragments, in implications, in careful language designed to avoid responsibility. They discussed options, schedules, explanations. They spoke about appearances, about how things might look, about what the town might say. They did not speak about harm. They did not speak about consent. They did not speak about him. He remained unnamed, even as his presence shaped every word. One sister insisted on control. She believed discipline could restore order, that strict routines and careful planning would prevent exposure. The other was less certain. She felt something slipping beyond reach, a sense that no amount of structure could undo what had already begun. That difference deepened the divide between them. For the first time, they were not united. The man listened, standing where he was told to stand, remaining unseen. He understood the reality more clearly than they did. If this truth became visible, it would not challenge the system itself. It would look for someone expendable, and he was the most expendable of all. That knowledge, told heavily. He considered speaking once, briefly, not to accuse, not to explain, just to exist as a voice. But he dismissed the thought quickly. Voices like his were not protected. They were erased. He knew that silence was still his only shield, even as it failed him. The sisters made their decision. They would proceed carefully, quietly, with discretion. They believed they could shape the outcome. Before anyone else had time to question it, they underestimated how quickly truth spreads. Once it exists, changes could no longer be hidden. The house staff noticed. Neighbors noticed. Even the town, slow to question, began to sense something was wrong. Whispers replaced silence, nothing explicit, nothing provable. But concern travels faster than certainty. The sisters felt it everywhere. In glances held too long. In conversations that stopped when they entered a room. Their reputation, once solid, began to feel thin. The man was watched more closely now, not with suspicion, but with calculation. His movements were monitored, his access restricted. They believed limiting him would limit the damage. They did not consider that he was not the source of the truth. He was simply where the truth had passed through. One evening, as the light faded and the house settled into quiet, the realization became unavoidable. There was no explanation that could erase what had happened, no arrangement that could restore the past. The truth existed, whether acknowledged or not. And with that realization came something unfamiliar to the sisters. Loss of control. They had always believed control was permanent, that it belonged to them by right. Now it felt temporary, conditional. They reacted differently. One hardened further, her demeanor cold and precise. She focused on logistics, on containment. The other withdrew, trapped between fear and guilt, her confidence eroded by uncertainty. Their bond, once seamless, was now strained. The man stood at the center of that strain. He felt the shift in how they addressed him, less certainty, more tension. He understood that he had become a liability, and liabilities are removed. That knowledge followed him everywhere. He slept lightly, ate little, listened constantly. Every sound felt significant. He did not know what form the consequences would take, only that they were approaching. The truth had changed the balance. It had turned certainty into fear, control into desperation. The house felt different now, not quiet. Waiting for the moment, when secrecy would no longer be enough. The sisters believed they still had time, still had options. They were wrong. Once the truth reveals itself, even partially, it cannot be undone. It reshapes everything around it. And the next decision made inside that house would not be about hiding the truth. It would be about surviving it. For some, survival would come at a cost. For others, it would not come at all. and the system that had allowed everything to happen was already preparing to protect itself. By sacrificing the easiest target, the truth was no longer just a secret. It was a force, and it was moving forward. Power does not disappear when it is threatened. It adapts. Inside the house, the truth had changed the balance, but it had not changed who held authority. Not yet. The sisters responded the only way they knew how, by tightening control. Rules that had once been unspoken were now enforced with precision. Schedules became rigid, movements monitored, access restricted. Everything was framed as order, as responsibility, as protection. But beneath the structure, fear had taken hold. The sisters no longer trusted silence alone. They needed certainty. They needed to know where everyone was, and what everyone knew, especially him. He felt the shift immediately. Instructions were no longer casual. They were exact, delivered without softness, without room for interpretation. He was watched more closely now, not openly, but deliberately. Every action mattered. Every pause was noted. He understood what was happening. When a system senses danger, it looks for control points, and he had become one. The sisters spoke often now, but never about the same things. Their conversations were tense, careful. They discussed appearances, timing, what the town might notice, and when. They discussed what could be managed and what needed to be contained. They did not discuss responsibility. That word never entered the room. One sister believed authority was still absolute, that firm action could restore stability, that people would accept whatever explanation was offered. She spoke with certainty, with confidence sharpened by desperation. The other sister hesitated more. She felt the weight of what had happened, and the uncertainty of what might follow. She asked questions the first sister did not like, questions about risk, about exposure, about consequences. Those questions created tension. Their bond, once effortless, now required negotiation, and negotiation is a sign of weakening power. The man remained silent, not because he agreed, but because silence was the only protection he had ever known. He listened carefully, watched closely. He knew that any decision made in that house would not be designed to protect him. It would be designed to protect the structure itself, and structures preserve themselves. By redirecting blame, he felt the isolation deepen. He was kept apart now, from conversations, from shared spaces. The distance was intentional. Distance makes it easier to justify decisions. It makes it easier to forget humanity. He became a subject rather than a presence, a problem rather than a person. At night the house felt restless, not loud, uneasy, doors closed with more intention. Footsteps paused outside rooms, then moved on. The sisters slept less, thought more. Fear has a way of sharpening the mind, while narrowing its compassion. The man sensed what was coming. Not a single event, but a shift, a movement toward resolution that would not include him as a voice. He understood the rules well enough to know that when fear meets authority, someone must absorb the consequences, and those consequences never travel upward. They travel toward those without protection, toward those without names in records, toward those without advocates, toward him. He prepared himself quietly, not to resist, not to escape. He knew escape was not realistic. He prepared himself to endure, to remain composed, to reveal nothing, because revealing emotion would make him vulnerable, and vulnerability invites decisions. The sisters noticed his composure. They interpreted it differently. One saw defiance where there was none. The others saw confirmation of risk. Both concluded the same thing. He could not be trusted to exist freely within his situation anymore. Control required limitation. They adjusted routines again, reduced his movements, limited his interactions, They believed containment equaled safety. They did not consider that containment increases pressure. Outside the house, the town's awareness continued to grow. People noticed changes, not specific facts, but patterns, absence, tension, a feeling that something was being hidden. No one accused, no one confronted. But attention was turning inward. Attention is dangerous. For systems built on silence, the sisters felt it in public spaces, in conversations that felt shorter, in glances that lingered too long. Their confidence began to feel performative, something worn rather than owned. Inside the house, discussions became more urgent. They spoke of solutions now, not explanations. Solutions imply removal of obstacles. The man recognized the shift in language. He had heard it before, used to describe tasks, repairs, problems. He understood what he represented, not a person, an obstacle. That realization did not shock him. It saddened him, not for himself, but for how easily people abandon humanity. When power feels threatened, the sisters believed they were acting rationally, protectively. They told themselves this was necessary, that order had to be preserved. They did not question why preservation required sacrifice. Fear makes justification easy. The house seemed to respond to the tension. Spaces felt narrower, the air heavier. Even daylight felt muted. The man moved through it carefully, aware that every step was being evaluated. He knew he was being measured against outcomes he could not control. He did not know exactly what would happen. Only decisions were being made without him. He accepted that reality quietly, because resistance would only confirm the danger they already believed he represented. And so he waited. Waited as conversations continued behind closed doors. Waited as control tightened. Waited as fear shaped choices. The sisters stood at a crossroads. They did not fully understand. One path required acknowledgement, responsibility, change. The other required silence, authority, and the removal of risk. They chose the path that felt familiar, the path the system had always rewarded. And in doing so, they set something irreversible in motion. Power had made its choice, and soon someone would be made to carry the weight of that choice alone. The house knew it. The man knew it. Only the sisters still believed they were in control. But control, once driven by fear, no longer belongs to those who hold it. It belongs to the consequences waiting ahead, and those consequences were already moving closer. The cost of what had been hidden became impossible to ignore. It did not happen suddenly. It did not arrive with a loud crash or dramatic announcement. It crept in quietly, shaping every corner of the house. Before anyone fully understood it, the sisters felt it first, not as a revelation, but as an undeniable weight pressing on their shoulders. Small mistakes now carried consequences. Disagreements, once harmless, became sharp. Even routine tasks felt like tests. They tried to maintain composure, to preserve the order they had always relied upon. But control built on silence is fragile, and silence has a way of exposing what has been ignored. The man remained in the background, moving as quietly as ever, his eyes alert to the changes around him. He noticed the way the sisters no longer spoke in the same tone, the way their movements had grown rigid, their glances sharper, their pauses longer than usual. The subtle cracks in their unity became obvious. One sister tightened her routines, insisting that every action, every task, every interaction follow exact precision. She believed discipline could contain what was spreading. The other became restless, her patience short, her voice sharp in ways it had never been. She questioned decisions she would previously have accepted without thought. The tension between them spread into the house itself. Rooms seemed smaller, the air heavier. Even the walls seemed to lean closer, bearing witness to the unspoken fear. Outside, the town sensed something too, not exactly what, but the absence of normalcy. People noticed the sisters were less visible, their smiles less frequent, their greetings shorter, more careful, Rumors began to stir, small murmurs that carried through conversations, that reached ears they were never meant to reach. And inside the house, the man understood his position better than ever. He was no longer just part of the secret. He was central to it, and central without power is dangerous. He took care to move carefully, to remain as unobtrusive as possible, to avoid drawing attention to himself, but containment has limits, and the sisters, in their attempts to control him, only increased the pressure. He was being watched more closely now. Every movement, every hesitation, every glance measured. Instructions came with sharper clarity. Patience was thinner. Tolerance had vanished. The house held it all, the tension, the fear, the unspoken accusations. Even the rooms seemed to shiver under the weight of secrets too heavy to bear. The sisters began to make decisions with the cost in mind. Every choice calculated, every action justified, and each decision subtly shifted responsibility. They did not notice how fragile their control had become, how quickly the walls of silence were eroding. The man, aware of the stakes, understood that one wrong move could make him the target. Yet there was nothing he could do but endure and remain composed. And as days turned into weeks, the cost became clear. It was not only the man who suffered, not only the house that carried the tension. The sisters themselves were paying too. Their unity fractured, their confidence shaken, their careful composure slipping in small, almost imperceptible ways. Every conversation, every glance, every action became a test none of them had signed up for. But all were trapped within. The house was no longer neutral. It had become a mirror of consequence, a reflection of every choice and every secret. And as the weight of the hidden truth pressed down, everyone inside, man and sisters alike, felt the gravity of what had been allowed to happen. Because secrets, no matter how carefully kept, always demand payment, and the cost is rarely paid evenly. The man, the sisters, the house, each would bear a part, but some would pay more than others, and when the reckoning came, there would be no place to hide. No matter how silent they tried to remain, the truth had already begun to speak, and it would not stop until it was heard. Names were erased, stories were rewritten, histories adjusted. Outside the house, the town went on as if nothing had happened. Letters were filed, records maintained, memories faded, slowly, carefully, like sand slipping through fingers. The sisters believed this was protection, that erasing details would safeguard them, that history, once corrected, would never question their choices. But history is patient, and it does not rely on permission. The man, though invisible on paper, was very real in the house. Every movement, every glance, every silent endurance was recorded in a way the sisters could not manipulate. They tried to maintain appearances, smiles for neighbors, polite conversation, calm composure in public, and yet cracks remained, the house remembered, the tension never left. Even if no one outside understood, inside, everything had shifted irreversibly. They avoided discussions about the past. They avoided acknowledging mistakes, and they avoided the man whenever possible. But silence cannot erase truth. It can only delay it. Visitors noticed the change too, subtle differences in behavior, absence of warmth, the lingering sense that something had been altered. Questions began to form quietly, not accusations, just curiosity, the kind that spreads slowly, like a shadow creeping over a familiar room. The sisters responded as they always had, with control. Schedules tightened, movements were restricted, access carefully monitored, yet even in their attempts to contain, they could not erase what had already happened. The man observed, silent as ever. Every adjustment, every new rule, every whispered plan was something he could not escape. He knew that when the moment arrived, to assign blame, to place responsibility, he would be the easiest target. The sisters had underestimated the persistence of memory. the way patterns reveal themselves, the way silence, no matter how thorough, cannot prevent questions from forming. Even the house seemed to sense it. Corridors felt tighter, rooms heavier. The air itself seemed to hum with anticipation. The sisters tried to ignore it. They controlled what they could, but control was now a fragile illusion, and the man, he remained central to it all, not as a decision-maker, not as an actor, but as the point around which consequence would spin. History, they thought, could be rewritten. But what happened inside the walls of that house was etched in a way paper and ink could not touch, and no matter what they did, the truth would find a way to demand recognition, because some things cannot be forgotten. Some things cannot be erased, and even when names disappear, even when records are altered, the echoes remain. The sisters would live with that echo, the man would live with it, and the house itself would carry it forever. Because what is hidden from the world does not vanish. It waits, waiting for the day someone notices, waiting for the moment history refuses to stay silent. And when that day comes, everything changes. Everything. No one remains untouched. The moment came quietly, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't heralded by loud voices or dramatic gestures. It came as a shift, subtle at first, like a ripple across still water. The sisters sensed it immediately. The balance they had maintained for so long was tilting, not because of anger, not because of malice, but because truth, no matter how deeply buried, cannot stay hidden forever. The man understood it too. He had felt the change building for W. Eeks, in the way instructions were delivered, in the way glances lingered, in the tension that made each room feel heavier. And now it could no longer be contained. The first signs were almost laughable to anyone else. A misplaced object, a door left slightly ajar, a fleeting expression that betrayed hesitation. But to those living inside the house, it was seismic. It shattered routines. It fractured control. It forced awareness where avoidance had long been the rule. The sisters reacted differently. One tried to restore order, tightening schedules, monitoring movements, asserting dominance in ways she had never needed to before. The other hesitated, aware that control had limits, and that even the most careful planning could not contain what was coming. The man became more cautious than ever, every step, every word, every glance measured. He understood that being at the center of this shift was dangerous, that survival required absolute composure. Outside the house, the town began to notice, not specifics, just the pattern of absence, of unease. Rumors whispered in the marketplace, questions asked quietly, answers avoided carefully. Inside, the tension became almost physical. Rooms felt smaller, the air heavier. Even familiar corridors seemed to press in, and the sisters realized that secrecy alone was no longer protection. Decisions had to be made, actions had to be taken. But no matter what they chose, the cost would be unavoidable. The man watched, silent, alert, calculating. He understood more than anyone else. History always demands a reckoning, and in that moment, the house itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the consequences to arrive. No one knew exactly how it would unfold. Not the sisters, not the man, not even the walls that had witnessed everything. But one thing was certain: when silence breaks and truth surfaces, nothing remains the same. The past cannot be rewritten. The secrets cannot be returned. The balance that once existed is gone forever, and those who once held control find themselves at the mercy of the forces they thought they had mastered. The man, the sisters, the house, all would bear the weight of what had been hidden, and when the dust settled, history would remember it all. Not the silence, not the control, not the fear, but the truth, because some secrets are too powerful to remain buried, and some stories are destined to haunt long after the house itself falls silent.